The British Empire, the largest the world has ever seen, didn't collapse because it ran out of bullets. It collapsed because it ran out of money. They said the sun would never set on the British Empire, and technically they were right, until the bank came to foreclose on the sunset. We are taught in school that empires die in battle. We imagine burning cities, barbarians at the gates, or nuclear fire. But that is rarely how a superpower actually ends. The British Empire fell victim to a specific mathematical inevitability known as the math trap. It's a cycle where the cost of maintaining global dominance exceeds the economic output of the nation itself. Britain faced extreme war-financed debt, a loss of its industrial edge, and the agonizing erosion of the pound sterling's power. Why does this matter today? Because if you look at the balance sheet of the United States, at the debt to GDP ratios, the hollowed out manufacturing base, and the weaponization of the dollar, you realize we are watching the exact same movie. We're just 30 minutes from the ending. Today, we are dissecting the financial suicide of the British Empire and asking the terrified question, is the United States about to default on its own superpower status? Act 1. Britain's reserve currency collapse and the blueprint for American decline. To understand the future of the American economy, we have to understand the history of the British ledger. For over a century, Britain wasn't just a military power, it was the central nervous system of the global economy. The pound sterling was as good as gold because, well, it was backed by gold. If you were a merchant in Shanghai, a rancher in Argentina, or a banker in New York, you settled your accounts in pounds. This gave Britain an exorbitant privilege, the ability to borrow cheaply and control global trade. But privilege breeds complacency, and complacency breeds debt. In this video, we are going to break down the three pillars of imperial collapse. First, we will look at the debt trap, how Britain went from the world's creditor to the world's beggar, and how the US debt to GDP ratio of 120% mirrors Britain's danger zone. Second, we'll examine the reserve currency curse. We'll show you the exact moment the pound lost its crown to the dollar and why the dollar's current dominance is more fragile than the Federal Reserve wants you to admit. And third, we will analyze imperial overstretch. This is the theory that suggests a nation eventually spends so much on its military to defend its economy that the military spending itself destroys the economy. Britain's decline wasn't an accident, it was a structural failure. And the cracks in the foundation of the modern global economy look identical. Act 2. The debt trap and the industrial hollowing. Let's start with a misconception. High debt alone doesn't kill an empire immediately. If it did, Britain would have collapsed in 1815. After the Napoleonic Wars, Britain's public debt hit a staggering £679 million. In today's terms, that debt to GDP ratio was over 200%. That is nearly double what the US is dealing with today. Yet, the 19th century became Britain's imperial century. How did they survive that debt load? The answer is simple: production. In 1815, Britain was the workshop of the world. They were the Silicon Valley, the Shenzhen, and the Detroit of the 19th century all rolled into one. They grew their way out of debt because they physically manufactured the things the world needed. When you produce real value, you can service massive debt. But fast forward to the early 20th century, a rot had set in. Britain stopped focusing on being the workshop and started focusing on being the banker. They shifted from an industrial economy to a finance-dominated economy. This is the first critical parallel to the modern United States. By the time World War I arrived, Britain's industrial edge was dulling. Germany and the United States were producing more steel, more chemicals, and more machinery. Britain was relying on invisible earnings, banking fees, insurance, and shipping. They were making money from money rather than money from things. Then came the wars. World War I and World War II were the most expensive events in human history. To fight them, Britain had to liquidate its assets. They sold off their foreign investments. They sold their railways in Argentina. They emptied the treasury. And when the cash ran out, they borrowed heavily. Who did they borrow from? The rising power, the United States. By 1945, Britain was technically a victor, but financially, they were a vassal state. They owed billions to Washington. The debt was no longer backed by a booming industrial engine. It was dead weight on a hollowed-out economy. Does this sound familiar? Look at the US today. Since the 1970s, and accelerated by entering the WTO with China, the US has systematically offshored its industrial base. Like late-stage Britain, the American economy has financialized. We generate wealth through tech valuations, derivatives, and service sectors, while the physical stuff is made elsewhere. When you combine a 120% debt to GDP ratio with a deindustrialized economy, you lose the ability to grow your way out of the hole. You are simply servicing interest on a credit card that you use to buy groceries from your competitors. Britain found out the hard way that you cannot finance a global empire on banking fees alone. Act 3. The death of a currency. Pound to dollar. This brings us to the second pillar of collapse, the loss of reserve currency status. For 100 years, the pound sterling was the bedrock of global trust. But trust is hard to gain and very easy to lose. The transition from the pound to the dollar didn't happen overnight, but it did happen violently. The turning point was the interwar period. As Britain's debt mounted, confidence in the pound wavered. Investors began to realize that the emperor had no clothes, or rather, no gold. The US dollar, backed by the massive gold reserves the US accumulated by selling weapons to Europe, began to look much safer. But the final nail in the coffin wasn't economic, it was geopolitical. And this is the most terrifying lesson for the US today. The year was 1956, the Suez Crisis. Britain, trying to maintain its imperial grip, joined France and Israel to seize the Suez Canal from Egypt. Militarily, it was a success. They took the canal. But financially, it was a suicide mission. The markets panicked. Investors started dumping the pound sterling aggressively. The Bank of England was bleeding reserves trying to prop up the currency. Britain turned to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, for emergency help. But the United States, which opposed the invasion, blocked the loan. President Eisenhower effectively told the British government, "Pull your troops out of Egypt or we will crash your currency." The US threatened to sell its massive holdings of pound sterling bonds. If they did that, the British economy would have imploded instantly. Britain had no choice. They withdrew in humiliation. That was the moment the world realized the British Empire was over. Not because they lost a war, but because they lost control of their money. The pound was demoted. The dollar was now the undisputed king. Now, look at the modern parallel. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency. It is the source of America's power. It allows the US to sanction countries, print money without immediate hyperinflation, and run massive deficits. But we are seeing the cracks. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are actively trading in local currencies. Central banks around the world are buying gold at record rates, diversifying away from the dollar. Why? Because they see the debt. They see the weaponization of the financial system. Just as the US used the pound against Britain in 1956, other nations are terrified the US will use the dollar against them. If the world loses faith in the dollar, if a Suez moment happens where the US cannot borrow to fund a crisis, the American standard of living, which is built on cheap imports and cheap debt, will collapse overnight. Act 4. The Imperial Overstretch. This leads us to the final and perhaps most fatal parallel, the concept of imperial overstretch. Historian Paul Kennedy coined this term. It describes a situation where a great power extends its military commitments beyond what its economic foundation can sustain. It is the trap of having global ambitions on a local budget. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Britain had to maintain the Royal Navy. The two-power standard required the Royal Navy to be as large as the next two largest navies combined. This was expensive, but manageable when Britain was the industrial leader. But as the economy hollowed out and debt rose, the cost of defence became a cancer. Britain had garrisons in India, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Middle East. They were policing the world's shipping lanes. By the 1940s and 50s, Britain faced a choice. It could have a welfare state at home, healthcare, housing, infrastructure, or it could have an empire abroad. It could not afford both. The United States is currently living this dilemma. The US spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. We maintain approximately 750 to 800 military bases in over 80 countries. We are guaranteeing the security of Europe through NATO, patrolling the South China Sea, and maintaining presence in the Middle East. Yet at home, the infrastructure is aging, the electrical grid is fragile, and the deficits are running at $1.5 to $2 trillion a year. This is the definition of imperial overstretch. The US government is borrowing money to pay for the military that protects the global order that allows the US to borrow money. It is a feedback loop. If the US cuts military spending, it risks losing the geopolitical dominance that props up the dollar. If the US keeps spending, the debt eventually collapses the system. It is only a matter of time.